I'll have to admit I wasn't very big on the Jets' chances in 2015, and here's part of the reason why. I wasn't sold on who they had brought in to be the new general manager, coming from the Houston Texans organization. I did like the choice of Todd Bowles to be their head coach. This was a team that was very active in trade market and free agency, bringing in guys like Ryan Fitzpatrick, all that goes with that. They brought in Brandon Marshall, active in terms of spending money on guys like Darrell Revis and Antonio Cromartie. So when teams tend to try to plug holes with trades and free agency, it's compensating for years of poor drafting. Those are the teams that I don't really like their chances. And usually I'm right. But in this case, I was clearly wrong. You're talking about a Jets team that was a pleasant surprise, I think, to the fan base and to the NFL in 2015. You had a 6-game improvement. They ended up finishing 10-6. And while they did miss the playoffs, they finished second in the AFC East, and they built themselves, I think, some potentially positive momentum for 2016, although that could come with some qualifiers. So, for a team that had that big of an improvement in 1 year, that was in the playoff mix and had a chance of Week 17 to clinch a playoff spot, a lot went right for him this year as an organization. The trade to get Ryan Fitzpatrick. I mean, he's a guy that threw for almost 4,000 yards, 31 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. I mean, he still has a propensity to have those Fitzpatrick moments, but there are other times where you get some Fitz magic, and I thought he was pretty solid throughout the year. The trade for Brandon Marshall was great. I mean, they didn't have to give up much to give him. It was a very low risk, potentially high reward type of situation. And Brandon Marshall arguably had his best season as a receiver in the NFL. And this is a guy that's, 31 years of age, 109 catches, 1,502 yards, 14 touchdowns. I mean, Brandon Marshall was a stud this year. There's no question about it. Bad laterals against the Eagles not included. The simple fact of the matter is this guy played like everything you would expect a number one wide receiver to be. And for the low price that the Jets gave up to get him, man, that deal ended up working magnificently. And what it did is it allowed Eric Decker to be in a better ideal role for him, which is to be the number one or number two wide receiver. So the whole signing of him now looks a lot better, and he had a good year too. 80 catches, 1,027 yards, 12 touchdowns. I mean, it seemed like almost every single game Eric Decker had a touchdown catch. I mean, it was just weird how almost every single week it's felt like Eric Decker was finding the end zone. So when you're talking about a 1-2 combination at wide receiver, the Jets had one of the very best in all of the National Football League. They got a nice season out of Chris Ivory, a guy that averaged over 4 yards a carry. Finished with over 1,000 yards. This was a very, very good Jets offense. Not elite or great, but they were pretty good. They were competent and more than competent. And at times, they could put some big point totals up on the board. 11th in the league in points scored per game, 10th in the league in total yards offensively per game. I mean, this was an offensive unit that you could win games with, as evidenced by the fact it went 10-6. This is an offensive unit that could have went into the playoffs and been something to be reckoned with. And then defensively, you saw some big improvements under Todd Bowles in 2015. The best thing could ever happen in this organization. Move the fuck on for Rex Ryan. Muhammad Wilkerson in a contract year was a monster. Big surprise, 12 sacks. And Leonard Williams, their first-round pick, 6th overall out of USC, had moments where he looked like he could be a nice player for them for years to come. Defensively, 7th in the league in points allowed, 4th in the league in total yards allowed per game. So you're talking about a defense that was borderline elite consistently throughout 2015, which is a big improvement over the past couple of years under Rex Ryan. It's a team that went 4-2 in the AFC East. They are 3-3, I believe it was, in the NFC East. Yeah, it was 3-3. I apologize. It was not 4-4. But one of those victories was against the New England Patriots. And that's good stuff. That's something positive to build on for the future. They went 3-1 versus the NFC East, 3-1 versus the AFC South, so you can see where all 10 of their victories came from. Garbage-ass divisions like the East and the NFC and the South and the AFC, you got to handle your business. 3-1 of each of those. For a lot of intents and purposes, that should have equaled that this team was a playoff team. And maybe they should have been. But ultimately, they didn't. And why was that? Well, there's a couple of factors here. Number one, they lost to the Philadelphia Eagles, an Eagles team that did not make the playoffs. Their one loss to an NFC East team was the Eagles, and that's a bad loss. The loss to the Raiders, no offense to the Raiders Nation, but that was a bad loss too for a 10-win Jets team. If you win one of those games, just one of those games, your Week 17 loss to Buffalo does not matter. And as a result, you know what you are. You're 11-5, and you're in the playoffs. And at 11-5, you might have been lucky enough to draw the Houston Texans in the first round, who you probably would have beaten, and you would have gotten to the divisional round of the playoffs. It's sometimes we always will look at the end of the season. We'll look at that, like I said, Week 17 loss to Buffalo, and that's what cost them. No. It's that loss to Philadelphia early on in the year. It's that loss to Oakland in the middle of the season. Those are the losses that you end up paying the price for. Those are the losses that end up catching up with you at the end of the year and put you in that potentially bad situation where you could miss the playoffs in Week 17, which the Jets ultimately did. It really killed them, though, I think, beyond just missing the playoffs, because that was a bad result for what was a pretty good year for this Jets organization to have 2 losses to Buffalo. I think they had 2 losses to Buffalo. It didn't fucking matter. Even losing to Buffalo once is something that just can't happen, especially that Week 17 loss. Because even with the losses early in the year to Oakland and to Philadelphia, you were in a position, you controlled your own destiny in Week 17. Just win and you're in. Just win and you're in. And they couldn't get that job done. And that was unfortunate for the Jets because, to me, I felt they deserved to be a playoff team this year, and it ultimately didn't happen. So now you head into this offseason. What are some of the biggest priorities for them? Well, this is a team I think they'll have about $20 million or so in cap space. They need to make a decision on Muhammad Wilkerson. I think there's a little more urgency to sign Muhammad Wilkerson than there was before, especially after the selection of Leonard Williams, because you thought, with Sheldon Richardson, maybe you've got Richardson, you've got Williams, you don't really need Muhammad Wilkerson as much. But, can you trust Sheldon Richardson to be there for you? Is he going to continue to get himself in trouble and put himself in bad situations? So now you look at it, is this team going to be willing to eat up the majority of its salary cap space to re-sign a guy like Muhammad Wilkerson at a position that is frankly already a strength for them on their defense? I don't know. But at the same point in time, how could they afford to let the guy go? Because he's been a really good player for them for several years, and he had a monster 2015, and you would expect several more big seasons to come. And the dude's a force. The dude's a beast. How can you just let that type of guy walk away and get nothing in return for him? Maybe you just sit there and try to franchise tag him and you try to kick the bucket down the road for another year and you see what plays out with Leonard Williams and his development in year 2. You see what happens in Sheldon Richardson's 4th year, and if he's able to stay on the field for 16 games, maybe that'll allow you to make a better decision long term. And maybe that's the direction the Jets should go. And frankly, that's probably the direction the Jets should go. Is buy yourself another year by putting a franchise tag on him. Yeah, maybe it will create some animosity and some bad will. But at the end of the day, if it all comes to pass and you decide you want to give him long-term money after that, then you'll give him long-term money after that, and Muhammad Wilkerson will be just fine, I'm sure. At this point, the other thing they need to do is they do need to go ahead and re-sign Ryan Fitzpatrick. I didn't know how this was going to work out for them. I'm like, he didn't work out at other places. Why would he work out here? But the fact of the matter is, there was some Fitzmagic there in 2015. Now, I'm not advocating they give him big, huge money, which is the danger and the risk of re-signing Ryan Fitzpatrick. You could be paying for 2015 and expecting to get that for another 2 or 3 years, and that might have been the best you're ever going to get out of Fitzpatrick. But this is a good situation, a team that can run the football, a team with 2 studs on the outside in Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker. A guy like Fitzpatrick, you scale it back a little bit, he could still be productive for you maybe for a couple of years, especially while you develop a young quarterback in the wings, whether that's a Bryce Petty or somebody that you go and get in the draft. So I think that is a priority. And they also need to make a decision on Chris Ivory as well. He did have a 1,000-yard season, but do you think you could do better? You've got all these running backs, him, Bilal Powell, I believe Ridley, they're all free agents. You're probably going to want to keep at least one of them. You're probably going to have to draft one at some point in time. Do you want to just go ahead and keep Chris Ivory, knowing that it probably is not going to cost you a ton to keep him because there's not going to be a huge market for him, you wouldn't think. Would it be nice just to have some stability and some consistency there at that position? And then they need to go into this draft and they need to improve their young depth on both sides of the ball. Now, when I look at the Jets team, their offense played really, really well, like I said, consistently pretty much throughout 2015. Fitzpatrick had a good year. Brandon Marshall was a stud. Decker had a really, really good year. Ivory had a solid season as well. But the fact of the matter is this is a team that has flat out ignored the offensive side of the ball at the top of the draft in the first few rounds for many, many years now. Many years now. And I've talked about this I don't know how many times, and those of you that followed me over the years know I've always harped on them about this. About every year come the first round, they're taking a defensive player, and how stupid I felt that fucking is. And at some point in time, those chickens come home to roost. Now, the thing is, with guys like Brandon Marshall, you acquire and trade, and Eric Decker in free agency, They're stopgaps. They help compensate. Hopefully you'll get something out of second-round pick Devin Smith a lot more in 2016 than you did in 2015, although he's going to be coming off of a torn ACL. Chris Ivory was a guy that you acquired via trade. Ryan Fitzpatrick was a guy that you acquired via trade. Trade market is an okay way to supplement things, but at the end of the day, it's not a way to build a long-term, consistent offensive unit. And this team is going to have to invest heavily in the offensive side of the ball, even if you don't anticipate certain areas to big needs. Although I think if you're a Jets fan, you would agree with me offensively. They have a lot of needs, and that again comes for years of poor drafting on that side of the ball and years of just flat out ignoring it with premium picks on that side of the ball by always trying to build up that defense and always focusing on that defense, and that was a fucking mistake. You look at them offensively. They need help at offensive tackle really bad. Ferguson's getting close to the end of the road. I'm not sold on what they've got at right tackle. They could actually use multiple offensive tackles out of this draft class, if I'm being honest. Again, I think they could use more help on the offensive line. They could use some help at the guard position. I know they signed James Carpenter in free agency, but again, it's having to use free agency to compensate for the deficiencies on the roster because of the years of poor planning and preparation on the offensive side of the ball and execution on that side of the ball via the draft. So they could use a more competent right guard, in my opinion. Maybe a long-term replacement for Nick Mangold at center. Mangold's over 30. Ferguson's over 30. Those guys are reaching the end of the road. You got to be prepared for what comes next. And then Jets offensive line, for all the things they did on the offensive side of the ball, that was not a good offensive line unit in 2015. And frankly, I'm surprised they were able to do what they did, considering that offensive line unit wasn't that good. In terms of the passing game, I think they could definitely use something at the tight end position because, let's face it, in the passing game, it was largely Brandon Marshall, then Eric Decker, a couple other guys like a Nunwa and Curley. You got a brief aberration blip from Devin Smith, and that's about it. But nothing out of the tight end position. I think Jeff Cumberland was their top pass-catching tight end this year, and he caught like 5 balls. You could talk to me about scheme responsibilities or what that offense likes to do. No, you need more out of the tight end position at the National Football League level. And we'll see if they ever get anything out of Jason Morrow. I wouldn't count on it at this point. So that's a position that I would expect him to address sometime within the first 3 to 4 rounds of this draft. But unfortunately for them, it's yet another tight end class that isn't all that good. At some point in time, I would expect the Jets to explore looking at getting another young quarterback. Geno Smith's not going to be the answer. I wouldn't be surprised if he was released this offseason or during training camp. Bryce Petty, are you really going to sit there and tie your future to Bryce Petty? Bryce Petty? Where the Jets are sitting at pick number 20, if Paxton Lynch is there, he is going to be incredibly, incredibly tempting. I do believe that. But running back is going to be tempting for them as well. If some flukish way in Ezekiel Elliott dropped to them at pick 20, that's got to be the pick, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But you get to round 2, maybe instead of a Chris Ivory and re-signing him in free agent in this offseason, maybe you look at a guy like a Derrick Henry. Maybe you look at other backs, guys like Kenneth Dixon and Alex Collins. There are some running backs that could be available for the Jets in rounds 2 or 3, and they need to invest in that position at some point in time in this draft. But they have needs on the defensive side of the ball, too. I still think they needed another edge rusher. I like some of what I saw out of Lorenzo Malden, their 3rd-round pick in 2015, but they need more there. They could use some young depth at inside linebacker because they've been getting by with David Harris and Demario Davis for years. They need an upgrade of talent and athleticism in the interior of that defense, and especially at the quarterback position, because you've got Screen, who's a nickel guy, and you really don't want to make him your number 2. You may or may not re-sign Cromartie, and if you don't re-sign Cromartie, Darrelle Revis is still a really good player. He's not quite as dominant as he once was. He's still a really good player, but you want to keep Screen in his role. You need to get a better number 2 corner. However, in this case, I do believe that the Jets do need to devote the majority of this draft to the offensive side of the ball, even if not every position that they invest in seems like a pressing need, because I assure you it actually is a pressing need, because those chickens will start to come home to roost sooner rather than later. And if the Jets want to build on the momentum that they accumulated in 2015 and they want to be a playoff contender in 2016, which for all intents and purposes they should be, they need to invest in the offense early and often in the 2016 NFL draft and make up for the mistakes that they've made the past 5, 6, 7 damn years.